Guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, February 3rd, 2025, and today we are going to be taking a look at the 2024 Senate elections. Yes, that's right. We're going back to November to take a look at the overperformers and underperformers of the 2024 Senate elections. A big reason why I wanted to do this is, one, I took a hiatus between the election and Donald Trump's second inauguration. I decided that with Donald Trump coming back into office, that we were going to start recording videos then and consistently post since then. What I missed in those past 2 months before then was that I wasn't able to make as many videos looking back at the 2024 election results, but they still are super relevant. We're years ahead of the next presidential election, over a year ahead of the next midterm elections, and so it'd be interesting to take a look at the 2024 races and see what it might tell us for the future of some of these Senate races that might come along the lines in 2026 and beyond. The 2024 Senate races, to put it plainly, were not the best for Democrats. They lost very winnable races, and for the most part, they were able to stop a lot of the bleeding that we saw happen on the presidential level, but still lost races that might have helped them when it came down to some of these confirmation hearings where Vice President J.D. Vance is breaking that tie where it's a 50-50 vote. Having 3 Republican defectors isn't enough, but used to be enough under Donald Trump's first term, used to be enough under different circumstances. Now, no longer is. And so Republicans having a 53-47 majority also sets them up quite well for future elections. In 2026 and in 2028, it looks like Democrats have very limited opportunities for pickups, and every single thing would need to go their way. Now, things have gone in their way in the past. In 2022 was a very good year for Democrats, didn't lose a single winnable seat, besides Wisconsin, but regardless, across the board, everything else would have to go beyond perfect for the 2026 and 2028 elections, which means chances are they probably won't. But let's take a look at the best overperformers, the biggest underperformers, and what this means for future elections. Now, you might notice a difference in the Senate map versus the presidential map. For one end, there are far more red states on the presidential map than on the Senate map. And that means that there are states that Democrats were able to win on the Senate level that they did not win on the presidential. There are 4 states, to be exact, that fit that classification: Wisconsin, Michigan, Arizona, and Nevada. Those are 4 states that, had the circumstances been different, Donald Trump would have won the presidential election and Republicans would have won the Senate not 53-47, but 57-43, which would be the biggest Republican majority in the Senate in the 21st century. Now, obviously, that didn't happen. Republicans did not get 57 Senate seats because Democrats fielded very strong candidates in Arizona and Michigan and were able to hold on with incumbents in Wisconsin and Nevada, despite national shifts that would have suggested otherwise. Now, the most impressive ones don't exactly exist only in Wisconsin, Michigan, Nevada, and Arizona. Just because a state went to the Republican Party doesn't mean some of these incumbents didn't perform well. So luckily, we have ABC News. FiveThirtyEight does their roundups after elections, and they put together the list of the strongest Senate candidates and the weakest Senate candidates. Essentially, the weakest would ever be wherever the difference here is more beneficial for the party that did not win that race. For instance, in Maryland, the strongest Senate candidate, according to FiveThirtyEight, is Larry Hogan, the former governor, who outperformed by 17 points. Still ended up losing by double digits. That's how partisan the state is, but it was a 17-point overperformance. In Montana, flip side, Democratic incumbent lost the race by 7 points, but outperformed Kamala Harris by 13 points across the state. So let's take a look. So Maryland and Montana, we've already mentioned. In Minnesota, Amy Klobuchar outperforming by 12 points. She is a really big shining star, I will say in this case. Sure, she was running against a very weak Republican, but at the same time, she was outperforming Kamala Harris by 12 points, when many of the other Midwestern Democrats simply could not do the same. Sherrod Brown is the closest, who outperformed by roughly 8 points in Ohio. Very impressive regardless. Still, not enough to win the election, and not as impressive as 12 points in a Midwestern state. Moving down, the next one you would have to take a look at is in the state of Michigan, where Elisa Slotkin only outperformed her opponent, her Kamala Harris, by 1.8%, Tammy Baldwin by 1.7%, and Bob Casey, who lost his race, by 1.5%. And so there actually are far more Democrats and far more Republicans even that were stronger candidates than the ones that defied the way their state voted on the presidential level. Now, does that mean there aren't things to be learned from Tammy Baldwin and Elisa Slotkin, who were able to outrun Kamala Harris? Absolutely not. There are absolutely so many things to be learned from these candidates. But when it comes down to overall outperformance, they actually weren't the strongest despite being able to defy the way the state voted altogether. So that's why we're taking a broad strokes look. Now, in Hawaii and Utah, those are states that don't really have any future competitive races to worry about. But the next state to look at is the state of Arizona, where Ruben Gallego outperformed by a whopping 8 percentage points. Now, some people can chalk that up to the Republican opponent being extreme and crazy. But Kari Lake and Donald Trump were far more similar than they were different. And at the end of the day, Ruben Gallego ran a strong campaign. Kari Lake might have run not so strong of a campaign, but it certainly was more measured than in 2022, might I say, than when she ran against Katie Hobbs, where she lost that race as well. But her reputation was so tarnished that voters were willing to say, I'm pro-abortion, passed the abortion amendment by double digits. I'm pro-Democrat. They won a number of their down-ballot races as well as the Senate race, but I'm pro-Trump on the presidential level. Ruben Gallego had a unique appeal and was able to do well in the state and tap in to the fact that many of the voters in the state probably did align with Kamala Harris on a number of issues, especially very relevant ones, salient issues like abortion. But when it came down to prominent issues like the border, Ruben Gallego was able to separate himself with Biden's administration, with Kamala Harris, and that's why he was able to do so well with a combination of other things too, right? Not to say Kamala Harris, was in a position where she was only associated with Biden. Sure, that was a big reason why she lost the election, her association with an unpopular president. But there was also distance there. But Ruben Gallego had made it clearer, and also too, to his credit, was a uniquely strong candidate who had been winning races in Arizona in his district, which wasn't necessarily competitive, but still had that electoral track record, was able to utilize that, and was able to win. So Democrats certainly have a lot to learn from him. They have a lot to learn from Sherrod Brown. That's also an 8-point overperformance. So we're taking a look all across the board here. Now, here's a really big one. This is a really big one. In the state of Nebraska, now there is no point of overperformance comparison because there was no Democrat running in the race. But this is where a lot of people really miss the, very competitive nature of it. Dan Osborne, the independent running for Senate in the state of Nebraska, came within 6 points in this state. It was one of the closest Senate races across the board, and that's why it matters. Nebraska should have been far better for the Republicans, but instead, it was a 7-point race. I mean, that's crazy to think about, right? Democrats expected to win narrowly. You find states like Maryland that were 12 points, Nebraska being 7. It's incomparable. It is truly incomparable. Now, Nevada and Arizona, being states as close as they were, probably should not have been in the expected to win narrowly column. They were true toss-ups, but Nebraska really should not have been. And so that was a unique overperformance for Dan Osborne. He was not Democratic aligned. He was an independent who took far more conservative positions publicly than liberal ones. So iffy on who he would have caucused with. He said he wouldn't have caucused, probably would have ended up doing so. There are many independents who have gone to the Senate and said, I'm not caucusing, ended up caucusing because you don't get any committee assignments. You don't get anything substantive in the Senate unless you do. Regardless, though, Dan Osborne really did showcase that he did quite well in that state. So Nebraska, huge overperformance there. But when it comes down to where Democrats should look to for areas where they can replicate victories, a huge one is Arizona. Another big one is Nevada. Nevada went to Donald Trump by a margin of roughly 3.1%. Jackie Rosen won by 1.6. That is a 5-point overperformance in a Senate race. Now, historically, she has done quite well. In 2018, she beat a Republican incumbent by 5 points, but the circumstances of the year were far more beneficial for Jackie Rosen than they were this time around. And yet, she still holds on, and Republicans still can't crack the Senate race in Nevada, but this was their first presidential victory in Nevada since 2004, so absolutely, accolades to them. Very strong victory for them. Didn't translate to down-ballot victories. And when you take a look at the House elections in Nevada, Democrats won the competitive district, the 4th, the 1st, and the 3rd. By close margins, but still pulled out ahead. So Democrats can learn a lot from Jackie Rosen and Ruben Gallego, especially as it pertains to minority and specifically Hispanic outreach. That's really where you saw them shine through across the board in these two states. Another two, Democrats that I would say that they should look at, Amy Klobuchar, for sure in Minnesota. And yes, even Sherrod Brown in Ohio, who was able to levy the popularity and the Democratic governance that he saw as popular amongst the voting base. And while it may not have translated to a victory, Donald Trump winning the state, by a substantive margin of 11 points probably did do him in this race here. And so overall here, I think there are a number of Democrats that are certainly worth listening to, at least when it comes down to how they were able to maximize their turnout, maximize their results. Republicans had some overperformances too, but I can't imagine the Republican Party right now is going to be listening to candidates like Larry Hogan. He's been completely ostracized by the party, disavowed by the Maryland GOP. Certainly not the people want to talk to. Elizabeth Warren isn't necessarily as popular in her state, which can explain why, as an incumbent, is underperforming Kamala Harris. And then again, across the board, not many of the Republicans I would look at and say, you are someone that I would want to talk to about electoral politics. Generally across the board here, it was almost consistently Democratic overperformance with limited exception. And again, I don't think the Republicans are inclined to listen to somebody like Larry Hogan. But looking back on 2020, the last thought experiment I want to explore here is exactly what this Senate map would look like, given, what the circumstances were in 2020. Knowing that Donald Trump won a state like Ohio, for instance, by 8.1%. Now, that would have made Ohio still a red state, but it would have narrowed it within a point that maybe in some circumstance, had there been Kamala Harris improving off of Joe Biden, that Sherrod Brown would have won. The set of circumstances that resulted in this Republican advantage, a state like Pennsylvania absolutely would have gone a different direction. After all, it was a 1.5% overperformance, and given that Biden did win the state by 1.1% or 1.2% in the last race, Bob Casey would have certainly won the race. Nebraska didn't shift enough that it would have mattered on the overall stretch, right? That state itself was still very much going to be for Donald Trump and for Deb Fischer, but still, when it comes down to some of these races, it is quite interesting. Now, when it came down to the Florida Senate race, there was very little movement here, a 0.3% overperformance for Democrats in the Senate race there, so not much there, even though it was a massive swing towards Donald Trump. So overall here, what we would have found is a Senate map that would look like this. The results of these confirmation hearings probably would look very different if this was the Senate map here, but Bob Casey is truly the only race that would have changed given a 2020 presidential election, which speaks to the fact that a lot of these Republicans did in fact have strong performances in Montana, in Ohio, and clearly in West Virginia, as well as in Texas, that was supposed to be competitive, as well as in Florida, that was supposed to be competitive. We learned a lot from this election, and I'm sure many Democrats did too. But they would be wise to listen to some of the strongest performers in the Senate races as they look ahead to how they can win in 2026 and 2028, because clearly some of these Democrats were very locked in, very tapped in, and very talented candidates. Democrats need to learn how to replicate that across the board nationally if they want to win back the Senate in 2026 or beyond. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my post-election 2024 analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.